Hey folks. Hey folks, welcome back to class. I just wanted to start us off with a couple of quick logistical things. So the first thing is I went back and I read a lot of your comments on one another's posts from your performances, and I really appreciate your interactions with your peers, especially how generous you're being and how insightful some of the constructive commentary you're offering is. I hope to provide equally constructive and insightful commentary on your performances when I give a small lecture about that tomorrow. I do, though, want to remind you that there are specific expectations for the length and what you are writing in terms of this feedback. So if you look on Sakai, under resources, under assignment prompts, there is a breakdown of what you're supposed to do. I had mentioned this, and hopefully you had this when you were doing your responses, but a few of you weren't writing as much as I had asked you to. So just remember that for each peer that you review, so you're supposed to review two different people in the class. So for each person, you're supposed to write two paragraphs. One paragraph is positive, and one paragraph is constructive, or raises questions, or makes suggestions, or poses problems, or anything like that. And then for each one of those paragraphs, they're supposed to be at 3 sentences long. I would say at least 2 to 3 sentences. So they're meant to be substantive. Again, this is one of your few opportunities to really correspond with your peers, and your peers really will benefit from your feedback. So if you posted early, which many of you did, because this wasn't due until Thursday, I would advise you to go back and perhaps flesh out your responses a little more to reach the guidelines, or to meet the guidelines that I had specified in that handout. And if you haven't posted yet, please do use the handout as reference, and hopefully that is helpful for you. But again, I do want to say mostly great work here. I did really appreciate your engagement with one another, and it was really nice for me to read your back and forths, which were very genial and professional, and also very helpful, I think. So thanks a lot. The second thing that I want to talk about in relationship to these is I have seen a pretty steep decline in viewership on our online videos since last week, so I am going to have to start taking attendance. It is absolutely necessary that you watch these videos because this is the only place you're getting the content explained to you. Again, I know it is a little bit difficult, and it sometimes might be, I think, harder for us to understand why we're talking about these philosophical concepts when we're really studying performance. But so much of performance studies is about thinking about the ways that performance allows us to do something different than what has come before, allows us to interrogate the assumptions of, or challenge the assumptions of, received thought in philosophy, in the humanities, in the sciences, and how it looks to create something different. So to understand performance studies, it's absolutely essential that you understand the place where it comes from, which is why we spend so much time on these pretty rigorous philosophical concepts. And I hope that these lectures distill these things in an effective way. I, of course, am happy to answer and will answer your FAQ questions or any other questions you send my way. Also, if you feel as if there's something that could be done to make these lectures more digestible or palatable to you, I would be happy to try to incorporate your feedback if you want to send some my way. I have been trying to integrate activities and videos occasionally into these lectures to break them up, but again, because the viewership is declining, I do want to make sure that I am doing my best to meet your needs. At the same time, you need to be meeting the course expectations, which is that you view these videos, if not at the time that they are assigned, then pretty close to that time, or else they're just going to stack up. Each one of these is an hour long. You don't have that much time to watch videos. So please do this. But in any case, I am going to have to start taking attendance about, or in terms of whether you view the lectures or not. So I'm going to ask that in the comments of the YouTube section, or in an email to me, you send your name. And, well, I mean, if you email me, I'll know your name. If you're posting on YouTube, it may or may not be clear, so specify who you are. And then just say one thing that you found interesting or insightful or provocative about the lecture. This can be 2 or 3 quick words, like just something to indicate to me that you have indeed watched it. Because I spend a lot of time making these, and I am really trying hard to communicate these ideas in ways that are both engaging and educational. So I really do hope that you will watch the lectures if you haven't been watching them as much. If you are having problems, I hope that you will contact me. And in any case, I am going to start asking you to verify to me that you have indeed watched the lectures. And I'll be able to tell whether you're making it up because there's a view count. So if a bunch of you have emailed me and commented, but there aren't views, I'll know something's wrong. So please be honest and actually watch these lectures. Anyway, I don't like lecturing in this capacity or being stern at all. I'm not much of an authoritarian teacher. I just really want you to stay on top of this because otherwise you're going to fall behind. So that's the end of my logistical discussion. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions about either of these things. The only other logistical thing I wanted to mention is that we're going to be talking about your poetry performance descriptions tomorrow, or what is expected from your poetry performances tomorrow. I had scheduled it originally for yesterday, but they're not until late next week, and we're going to be talking about poetry tomorrow, so that should be a good time to introduce it. So today, then, we're just going to focus on the Hall reading about Black popular culture, and I'll explain its connections to performance when we get there, but you should, I think, have already seen some connections between Hall and the Fanon piece that we read last time, and then we'll talk about Irving's piece, Waking Up White. So that's sort of our agenda today. But yes, so we're going to move on to content now. But again, thank you for attending to these logistical issues, and please let me know if you have any questions about this. Alright, so let's get started talking about Hall's essay, What is the Black in Black Popular Culture? So this is an interesting, I think, although definitely challenging essay. I just wanted to read this today to pull out a few of its highlights. So I don't want you to get mired in the nitty-gritty of the discussion of the stages of popular culture or cultural development that Hall talks about here, or anything like that. That's not really what our focus is. Our focus here is instead on understanding what the politics of performance are in relationship to racialized or ethnic culture. How should we think about performance and the construction of art and music and things that we would typically call popular culture as being political, and how should we imagine the relationship or understand the relationship between popular culture and race, and especially popular culture and blackness. So that's the main focus that we want to pull out of the Stuart Hall reading today. So for those of you who might be less familiar to the term, or with the term, popular culture is usually used to refer to the types of cultural performances that people do outside of the mainstream, Or this is at least how it was originally conceived, was that there was an opposition that was posed between high culture on the one hand and popular culture on the other. So high cultural traditions would be things like ballet and certain forms of classical theater and classical music, all of these forms that belong in many ways to white European culture and are considered the higher forms of art. So he refers to here high culture as the last refuge, this idea that high culture is the pinnacle of the cultural productions of a given nation, or Europe or the United States, however you would want to put it. High culture would be the top of its cultural forms. But it would usually be opposed against low culture. Things like jazz, at least when it first came out. Things like rock and roll, when that first came out. These types of forms of popular expression are things that we would usually say are not or do not belong to high culture. But those forms, what belongs to high culture and what does not belong, is both, Hall would argue, something that has more to do with power than it has to do with anything that is culturally expressed. That is, it has to do more with who is in charge and how they go about valuing culture and monetizing the value of culture than who makes the art and how good that art is, or who does the performance and how good that performance is. That the distinction is not about artistic forms and their content or their substance or their value. The distinction is about the way in which people, through power, have valued certain forms of culture over others. So all of this is to say then that Black artistic traditions have typically been treated as popular culture, that they've typically been treated as low culture, things that come from outside of the mainstream of high culture, which is, in Hall's argument, something that is usually defined as European or at least white, So you can think then of the way that forms that come from African Americans or Black individuals in Europe, so things like jazz, things like rock, things like blues, those sorts of artistic forms are oftentimes treated as low culture, and then definitely hip-hop, when that originates in the 80s and the 90s, is treated as one of the lowest forms of culture. I've had terrible experiences before, even in our current day. I went to see once, when I was in college, a poet reading, who was a very famous poet, poetry being something that for a long time belonged to high culture. And that poet, who was white, compared hip-hop to the sound of animals being kicked. And that is a racist accusation that is defending the difference between poetry and hip-hop, when really there is hardly a difference at all. And as we've discussed and will continue to discuss, poetry in hip-hop and in its written form has become one of the main vehicles through which Black culture attempts to interrogate racism and interrogate whiteness and express its cultural identities. So in those circumstances, then, the exclusion of Black culture as low culture is fundamentally a racist formulation. But Hall's argument isn't just that this formulation or this opposition between high and low culture, it's racist. The argument is that it is in fact untenable, or something that a distinction that we can no longer maintain in our current political and cultural situation. So there are sort of two main ways that you want to think about the challenge that he makes to the distinction between high and low culture and its relationship to race. So the first thing that he wants to do is distinguish between the European tradition and the American tradition. So he says then that Western Europe, quote, did not have until recently any ethnicity at all, or didn't recognize it had any. America has always had a series of ethnicities, and consequently, the construction of ethnic hierarchies defined its cultural politics. American popular culture has always contained within it, whether silenced or not, Black American popular vernacular traditions. So the first part of Hall's argument then is to say that when we think about Europe and European culture, oftentimes we have this perception of a culture without race or without ethnicity, but that is of course maintained by dominant power structures. What Hall is saying, though, is that in the United States, that sort of pretension toward racial blindness or ethnic blindness is never something that is fully integrated into U.S. culture. That from the very beginning, he argues, both through the genocide of the Native American people and the racial subordination of Black individuals that is required by slavery, that both of those things require the establishment of ethnic hierarchies in the United States. So there's always an idea of ethnicity opposed to, or that is, and so a hierarchy is one thing is above the other, right? So there's always the idea of multiple different ethnicities in the United States, some of which are said to be inferior to others, and this is something that we'll talk about in detail when we talk about Irving's piece as well. But Hall's point here isn't just, obviously, that America was founded on racism, it's that despite this, that Black popular culture, that Black cultural traditions, or Black vernacular traditions, as he calls them, are something that have always been extremely influential on U.S. culture, have always almost defined U.S. culture. So if you think about any of the forms of art that we think about in some ways as being uniquely American, like blues or like rock and roll, those sorts of traditions were originated by Black individuals and then incorporated into white cultural cultural traditions, incorporated into white cultural traditions. So Hall's point here then is that it is possible to have cultural influence without having actual power inside of a society. Without having actual power inside of a society, your cultural productions can still influence that culture. So that is his first point, is that American culture has always had this ethnic hierarchy inside of it that is fundamentally racialized and is fundamentally racist and prejudiced, but at the same time, Black culture has always had an outsized influence on American culture. So that's step one. Step two is thinking about what he calls the global postmodern, which is definitely a little bit above our pay grade to talk about what postmodernity is right now, but we will, just very briefly, because understanding this point I think is really helpful to understanding the larger argument he is making here. So very briefly, postmodernism is in some ways a school of philosophical thought, but in other ways is just a way that people talk about the current culture inside of, or after really the 21st century really picks up. So people talk about postmodernism starting in the 1960s and the 1970s as describing the state in which both globalization is occurring, so the boundaries between different nations and national identities are starting to be dissolved, even though America is, in this period of time, the dominant cultural influence globally, and that postmodernism is in particular defined by the collapse of the difference between low and high culture. That is, that there is no longer one form of culture that is institutionalized and one form of culture that is excluded, that white music producers make money off of hip-hop, that Black artists are shown in museums, and people like Banksy who do street art are shown in museums, that Andy Warhol, who is definitely not a Black artist, but who just created soup cans and stacked them, like that dissolves the boundary between high and low art. The question of what art is anymore becomes paramount. All what matters about this is that Black vernacular culture in the United States and its cultural influence becomes global then. That the way in which we conceive of Black cultural traditions has become something that is incorporated into the global artistic traditions or the global traditions of popular culture, that many, many, many people make blues music and jazz music from different nations, of different ethnicities, of different cultures, and is considered, jazz especially, high culture now in many circumstances. Hip-hop is still not really considered high culture, but it is still treated in a derogatory way in a lot of circumstances, but it has not stopped white individuals from listening to hip-hop and enjoying hip-hop, and from white record producers and white record industry owners from marketing hip-hop and making millions and millions of dollars off of it. So the idea here then is that what the global postmodern does is it takes the situation Hall describes in the United States, where even though Black individuals are racially subordinated and are discriminated against and are oppressed, that those cultural traditions have a value or an influence on American culture in spite of that, So this is one of the major challenges that Hall wants to pose then to the way that we have talked about Black cultural politics or Black artistic politics in the past, and how he wants to talk about them in the future. So he thinks then about the way in which how we've been talking about the division between high culture on the one hand and low culture on the other, or popular culture on the other. A corollary of thinking about high versus popular culture is that popular culture has oftentimes been treated as subversive or radical or revolutionary or opposed against capitalism or opposed against white culture, or opposed against whatever the hegemonic or the most powerful culture that defines a nation or a country or a continent is. So when we have then this idea of popular culture as resistant, a lot of times then that would make it problematic to talk about something like hip hop or jazz as popular culture when it is then incorporated into these more powerful systems. But here he wants to say that the political productivity of a country, or I'm sorry, of a culture, the political productivity of black culture, its subversiveness or its resistance to dominant power structures, it isn't necessarily dependent on actually overthrowing those power structures. That those sorts of all or nothing mentalities are counterproductive. So if popular culture has not succeeded then, or if black popular traditions have not succeeded in destabilizing racial oppression, he doesn't think that that means that they're without value. He's instead interested of thinking about the cultural strategies that define the production and consumption of black culture, or black popular culture. That is, he's interested in thinking about how it is that the consumption of black culture exerts a cultural influence, how the production of black culture exerts a cultural influence or a political influence, despite the fact that black individuals and the people who are responsible primarily for originating and producing this culture remain marginalized. So he says then that black culture or black popular culture is a space of contestation, so a space where that is contested or debated over, that can't be solely understood in terms of an opposition between the high and the low. That cannot be solely understood as the opposition between the high and the low. So this is again to say then that black artistic traditions aren't isolated from white artistic traditions or isolated from the traditions of those in power, that they break down that distinction because black cultural traditions are marginalized but then incorporated into the main culture of the United States and globally in general. So in terms of understanding the implications of this for performance, there are two main things that I want us to take away from this. The first one is an observation, and the second one is a question. The first one is an observation, and the second one is a question. So the observation is that it doesn't make sense to talk about black cultural traditions, or really popular cultural traditions in general, in terms of a purity or authenticity of form. That is, we should not understand that black cultural traditions, or black performances, the performance of black culture is only legitimate when it is in some ways pure, a real recreation of a cultural tradition that otherwise was marginalized in the United States. Hall's argument is that this isn't possible. And this isn't possible for a couple of reasons. One of these is that, the first reason is that all forms at this point in the context of the global postmodern are hybrid forms. He says, quote, "Always these forms are the product of partial synchronization, which means things coming together or happening at the same time, engagement across cultural boundaries, the confluence of more than one cultural tradition, the negotiations of dominant and subordinate positions, of subterranean strategies of receding and transcoding, or critical signification or signifying." So the argument here then, in this very dense or somewhat dense language, is that both we create hybrid forms of culture all the time through interactions that either happen organically or happen through contestation or through bloody power struggles, that the tension between what is high and low is always fought over, and through this we engage with different cultures and produce new cultural forms that can no longer really be said to belong to one culture or another, or to be pure expressions of a black cultural tradition or of the cultural tradition of a particular country. That is the first argument, is that we can't really think about it in terms of the purity of the tradition, that we need to think about it instead as something that is necessarily hybrid, that is always changing. And so, he says, if we think about things in terms of these hybrid forms, the way that we should analyze the performances that we see in popular culture that reflect Black culture, the ways in which we analyze media texts also, or any other form of popular culture, but obviously for us, performance is the most important thing. The way in which we analyze those things, we should not just say, okay, is this an accurate representation of Black culture? Or is this a representation of Black culture that successfully captures a traditional form of Black artistic production? That's not how art usually works, that art is hybrid, and those questions are necessarily political in nature as much as anything. So he says that what we should do instead is think about the politics surrounding the production of Black culture and the politics surrounding the consumption of Black culture, and we should critically analyze these things. So when we think then about analyzing the production, the politics of, so, when we think then about analyzing the production and consumption of Black culture, we want to ask questions about what it means for people, for instance, who do not belong to Black culture to perform things that belong to Black culture, were originated by Black culture. Is that something that is politically problematic, or is that something that is politically promising because it speaks to hybridization and intercultural interaction? We want to think about the ways in which white individuals consume Black culture. For instance, do white individuals know that the cultural tradition they are consuming is an expression of Black culture at all? I think that many people do not know that rock and roll, for instance, is innovated by Black culture rather than white culture, because it is white culture that popularizes it. And indeed, some media texts tell a story that seems to re-envision the birth of rock music as something that is white in nature. So if you watch the clip that I've provided, for instance, you'll see that Back to the Future writes this revisionist history in which it was not, indeed, Little Richard who really invented rock and roll, but it was Michael J. Fox playing Little Richard songs by time traveling. And that reflects the way in which, for many people, so Elvis and the Beatles, for instance, have been accused of appropriating rock and roll traditions, but then popularizing them and being able to popularize them because they were white and not Black. So when we think about these mediums, then, we want to think about their racial politics not just in terms of what do they express, how do they express Black culture, or what do they say about Black culture, but we also want to ask about the power that goes into the production of these things and the power that goes into the consumption of these things, how both of those things might reflect racial biases or racial logics. The second thing is the question, and this is something that I can't answer. I mean, I can't really weigh in on a lot of these discussions because as a white person, there are limits to what I know. That most of what I know has been through my interactions with peers and media texts and also through reading literature such as this. But Hall makes an argument here that I want us to critically consider, and this is his concluding sort of argument, is that up until this point, the idea of Black popular culture as being something that is unified and not a hybrid form or multiple hybrid forms, the idea of there being one thing called Black culture is something we would call a strategic essentialism. That is, we talked about essentialism last time as saying there is one thing that defines the essence of X. So there is something that defines Black culture. There's something that defines Black people. There's something that defines white people or white culture. There's something that defines X, Y, or Z. This is the essence of the thing. So to say that this is a strategic essentialism is to say that for a long time, both in the production of performances and in social struggles for social justice, like social justice movements and the civil rights movement, that Black culture was represented strategically as one thing because that was necessary for the political coalition to form that would allow for real political change. Hall says that now we are in a day and age in which that sort of conflation of all of Black culture together is more problematic than productive, and we should instead move to stress the multiplicity of Black cultures and the particularity of the experience of different people of different nations, people of different ethnic descents, people of different skin tones, that the way in which people are Black is multiple, just like the way in which people are any ethnicity is multiple, that everybody is multiple, and that we ought to stress the multiplicity of that culture, the complexity of that culture, instead of saying there's one thing called Black culture. I do not know how to feel about this argument in our current political context. So Hall says here, again, that this was strategic, that this type of essentialism was strategic even though that it was inaccurate, that there was never a such thing as Blackness, that there were always multiple Black cultures and multiple Black ethnicities and multiple Black nations, but that it was strategic to present it in this way in order to struggle against racial oppression. At the same time, he argues, we ought to move past that now and try to nuance or make more complex our vision of what Black culture is. But in a moment like the moment that we have now, in which Black Lives Matter protests, for instance, are gaining so much traction and creating these incredible reforms across the United States, and we still see racialized oppression and anti-Black violence as something that is 100% defined in this bipolar way where there is white and then there is Black, that this complexity, or the strategic essentialism, rather, of referring to and trying to represent Black culture as a unified front of people who have all been equally dispossessed, even though there is this difference, may still have a strategic necessity. Black Lives Matter, saying that, is a type of strategic essentialism, in that it says that there is one thing called a Black life. But the problem is that it's not, you don't make that assertion because you think that Black people are all the same. If you're a supporter of Black Lives Matter, you make that assertion because the way in which Black people are treated means that everybody is equally at risk. So the complexity that Hall is calling for then might have been a little bit premature, perhaps. He might have been talking about looking to a new horizon of the struggle for racial justice, thinking that the civil rights movement and decolonization had been more successful in changing our mentalities than they really had been. So that's something that I want us to consider, or to think about critically, is at this point, when we think about the relationship between race and performance, is the performance of race something about something that should try to communicate a universal condition, or something that is universally true, or close to universally true about members of that race? So in this circumstance, should it try to convey the universal experience of Blackness? So you could think about, for instance, in Sunny's performance that you watched yesterday in the talk, there is something that is every parent that is Black will have to have this conversation with their Black child. There is something universal about it. But at the same time, the idea that there is a particularity and nuance to Black culture is incredibly important. And oftentimes we elide this, or we overlook this, when we just talk about Black culture as one monolithic thing. So the question then of whether we should try to perform when we are performing race, or if we are performing on the issue of race, whether we should try to perform things that are universal to the experience of that race, or to illustrate the nuance and complexity, the fact that race in fact houses multitudes, or some combination of the two. That's how I want us to think about all of this discussion of Hall when we move forward from here. What would it mean to make really politically productive performances that deal with subjects of race? Is that going to be more productive if we try to deconstruct or illustrate the limitations of viewing things through a racial lens? Or is it going to be more productive in circumstances in which we do try to communicate something that is universal about Black experience, or universal about white experience, or universal about X ethnicities, Latinx experience, or whatever ethnicity you would want to name's experience? In that sort of performance, those explorations, what is more valuable? Is complexity more valuable? Is universality, or saying that this is what this cultural experience is like in general, or is it more valuable? Or is there some kind of productive combination between the two? Or is there some kind of productive combination between the two. So as we move on then to discuss Irving's piece on whiteness, I want us to keep this question in mind. How should we think about the relationship between performance and race in a way in which we can think about performing on the issue of race to make a political or social difference? So that's where we're going to wrap up this lecture and this discussion of Hall, and then we're going to move on to talk about Irving's lecture, or I'm sorry, the Irving reading, Waking Up White. So I'll talk to you in just a second.